One batch, two batch, penny and dime. So The Punisher Season 1 tells the story of Frank Castle, an Army veteran whose family was brutally murdered in front of his eyes, and he is out for a bloodthirsty revenge against his family's killers, as well as trying to stop a government conspiracy. Well, the time has come, everybody. Even though I'm a couple weeks late doing this review, The Punisher is here. I love The Punisher. In my top 5 comic book characters of all time, The Punisher is cemented in that list. I have always loved that character. I've loved some of the movies. I love most of the video games. I've read quite a few of the comics. The Garth Ennis stuff is probably the best. Punisher Born, Punisher Max, all that stuff. Huge fan of the character. And whenever Jon Bernthal was cast as Frank Castle, the Punisher, in Daredevil Season 2, I went nuts for that season. I thought that everything that they brought to that character, everything that Jon Bernthal brought, everything that they did as far as the interaction with Daredevil and Frank Castle, all of that was flawless to me, and all of that was kind of like this precursor origin to the Punisher. In promises of this first season of this Marvel Netflix show, The Punisher, where we finally get the actual Punisher TV show that this character deserves. Now I'll go ahead and get it out the way. I was a fan of this first season. I think that it does so many things right. I think that it gets so many things right about the character. Jon Bernthal is as great as he's always been, and he brings everything that you want to this character for the most part. There's a few things that I'm going to talk about that I was a little bit disappointed in. We'll get into all that. But right away, the first positive of The Punisher Season 1 has to be Jon Bernthal. Like, I have loved this guy ever since The Walking Dead. I was one of the only people in the world that constantly said that Shane was my favorite character, even though he was a sadistic bastard. I loved what Jon Bernthal brought to the character. I loved how human he was. I loved how real he was amongst all the characters that just felt too overly written. So I have loved Jon Bernthal since we all got kind of introduced to him since that first season of The Walking Dead. And this is probably one of the best things that he's ever done. He fits the character of Frank Castle and the Punisher perfectly. He's got his own little take on it. He doesn't feel like he's copying what Thomas Jane or what Ray Stevenson or even what Dolph Lundgren did. He doesn't feel like he's outright copying what some of the comic book storylines have done. He's bringing his own flavor to it. He's making the role his own. And it's the type of Punisher that makes sense within this kind of modern retelling of this ex-Army veteran kind of post 9/11 world that they're going for with this Punisher Season 1. And with Jon Bernthal's performance, you get two sides of Frank Castle, which are two very important sides. You get the very haunted, broken, just kind of praying for death while dealing out death side of Frank Castle. And you also get kind of the charming, humanized person that kind of longs for that humanization again, longs for interaction, longs for family, longs to be a part of society again, but can't quite get there. You get both sides of that, and sometimes within the same scene with Jon Bernthal, and both sides of that Frank Castle, I think he nails perfectly. He's scary, he's violent, he's brutal when he needs to be, but he's also charming and endearing and very friendly in the way that some of Jon Bernthal's roles have been on the other side of Frank Castle. So I think as a whole, the different spectrums of Frank Castle, Jon Bernthal kicked ass as Frank Castle. Another huge positive, which I'll be honest, is probably my biggest positive as far as the achievement of this first season. I love the villain in this season. Not only do they give a very different and a very modern retelling of the villain Jigsaw and the origin, the long season-long origin of the villain Jigsaw, but this is one of those examples of taking a comic book character, taking that lore, taking that pre-established storyline and that pre-established personality of this villain, and retooling it and kind of meshing it around to fit this new modern storytelling and this new version of Jigsaw while holding on to what makes that character Jigsaw. And to me, it's just flawless the way that they did it. I think it's going to be, at least we'll get to see in the next season, hopefully whenever Jigsaw comes back, if he in fact comes back. I think this is going to be one of the best tellings of that character Jigsaw, and I think it's going to be way better than anything that we could have gotten from a Jigsaw movie or a Punisher movie Loved what they did with that character. In this modern retelling, you got Frank and then you got Billy, who ends up becoming Jigsaw. In this version, they're actually brothers in arms. They're best friends. They're basically, he's the uncle to the kids. He's basically part of the Castle family. They have this split, which starts going into kind of some of this intrigue, into some of this government corruption and all these little things going on behind the scenes that led to Frank Castle's family's death. And it's this season-long kind of slow burn of betrayal and realization on Frank Castle's part to finally have this confrontation of people who used to be brothers. Billy is totally the Joker to the Frank Castle, which is exactly what Jigsaw should be. Just really was over the moon happy with what they did with that character, because Jigsaw can be so corny and so cheesy and so campy very easily, as we've seen in Punisher Warzone. And I thought that the way that they kind of retooled that character, like I said, the biggest achievement of this season from a Punisher fan. But you also get some other side characters that are great. You get Frank Castle's main accomplice, Micro, and the actor that portrayed him did really well. And I love how their relationship kind of budded throughout the season. It was kind of antagonistic, not a whole lot of trust, a lot of annoyance between them. And then they kind of grew through this brotherhood, and they really grew to care for each other and to really have each other's back, as Frank Castle was losing that relationship with Billy, or Jigsaw, however you want to call him. So it was kind of this interesting little shift where Frank Castle moved away from Billy and moved towards Micro. And even the family storyline, as far as Micro's family and how Frank Castle has to interact with them and protect them, and Micro has to kind of live vicariously through Frank Castle because he can't be around his family out of fear that they'll get hurt. All of that I thought was done really well. And as far as like side stories going on throughout this season, that was one of the most intriguing and endearing side stories of this first season.
You and me, we want the same thing. So work with me. On one condition. I'm gonna kill them all. Yeah, I can live with that.
And I even liked the main CIA agent who's kind of hunting down Frank Castle. Her name was MATINEE, I believe. She was actually a pretty good character too. I feel like they focused a little bit too much of the show on her, and honestly the spots wherever it was really focusing on her relationship with certain characters and what was going on with all these different levels of intrigue within her CIA operative relationships was going on. That was kind of where the season started to lull a little bit for me. But her character itself, I really liked. I liked how she grew to have this relationship with Frank Castle. I love how she kind of changed her motivations throughout the season and where she ended up at the end of the season. And Frank Castle, it showed more of his humanized version where he was actually trying to help her and trying to protect her while she was the one hunting him down. I liked all of that stuff for the most part, but her character I thought was a success overall. Now, one of the biggest things that I was walking into the season hoping for, especially after some of the scenes in Daredevil Season 2 that they really delivered on a few times, not quite enough, which I'll get into, but a few times they really delivered on, which is these badass, blood-filled, gory, rated R action scenes that you need in a Punisher TV series. There is a sequence in this, I think the second to last episode, where these government operatives are coming in and storming Frank Castle's hideout, and he just hides in the shadows and fucks them up one by one. That entire sequence was the greatest part of this entire season to me, and one of the highlights of this entire Marvel Netflix little experimentation thing we got going on. It was awesome. But sliding into my negatives of this season, that sequence was so awesome, it just begged the question of why there wasn't more of that throughout this season, because honestly, the majority of this season is pretty quiet and honestly a little bit slow. The season starts with a pretty good punch, then it kind of dips down for a little while. It picks up continuously for the last, I'd say, 5 episodes or so. It just goes up and up and up to the point where you were just next episode, holy shit, this is awesome. But there is that little bit of a slow point in the first third into the second third of this season that I feel like this season would have benefited from being an 8 or 9 episode season like the Defenders was, and not trying to stretch out 13 episodes worth of story. It kind of got a little bit drawn out and got a little bit too much filler for my own personal taste. I feel like it could have been tighter, threw in at least one more of those action sequences, and you would have had a flawless season of Punisher. And part of the reason why it felt like such a lull there in that section of the storyline was because they focused so much on this post-veteran lifestyle and PTSD and how people are affected with war and coming back from the war and not knowing how to be anybody without a war going on. And you have this little group of this soldiers that are back and they're going through PTSD, and it's kind of like this group therapy, and there's certain characters that end up being villains later on, like a side villain. And while that aspect of the storyline is interesting to go into for a little bit, for this version of Punisher where he is a ex-war vet and it's in this post 9/11 kind of war on terrorism style of the Punisher, that's interesting to dip into, but to spend so much time in this season, honestly, it made this season feel more like a season of Homeland than a season of the Punisher. Now, Homeland is great, at least the seasons that I've seen, but that's not quite what I want from the Punisher. And while I'm on the subject of what I want from the Punisher, I'm gonna go ahead and kind of grit my teeth a little bit and wait for season 2 before I make extreme judgment on this, but I'm a little bit worried about some of the directions they're taking the character of Frank Castle in this iteration. The Punisher is not a good guy. The Punisher is just as bad, just as evil, and just as vicious as all of the villains that he is taking out. That's the way it is in the comic books. That's the way it should be in this if it's going to be a true adaptation of the Punisher. And I just feel like they're making him a little bit too much heroic, a little bit too anti-hero. You got to have some aspects of the character that you can root for. You got to have some reasons to think of him as your good guy, absolutely, but he's not quite the heroic person that they make him in this season. I'm fine with them doing that for the first season, but as this story goes on, especially when Jigsaw really start doing his thing, I think he needs to dip a little bit more into being the true Punisher, where he's just this bloodthirsty, brutal, murdering psychopath, because that's who the Punisher needs to be. So a little bit throughout this season I was going, when is the Punisher going to show up? Because it still feels like after the season of Daredevil, they felt like they were going to get right into the Punisher after that, and it still feels like they're leading up to the Punisher somehow. So when are we going to get the Punisher? That's the big question that I have. They've got the violence down, they've got the brutality down, they've got the insanity of Frank Castle down. I just feel like they need to take that next step, push it a little bit farther into that darker territory, which they might have full intentions of doing in a season 2, which is why I'm kind of holding my judgment on it. But just to be honest, that was a bit of a disappointment for me that we get a whole season of the Punisher, and as a longtime Punisher fan, it didn't quite feel like the Punisher all the way to me. But with all that being said, this was still a badass season of television. I was not bored one bit, which I've been really bored with the past 3 seasons of this Marvel Netflix shows. Luke Cage, Iron Fist, and The Defenders. Could barely get through 2 of them. Didn't get through 1 of them at all. The Punisher was a nice leap back into that level of quality of the seasons of Daredevil, and my personal taste, Jessica Jones. So it was a good thing that I walk into The Punisher with such high expectations, and for the most part, most of those expectations were met pretty damn well. Some of them were even exceeded. So Punisher season 1, fuck yeah.
The world needs to see the truth.
So if you're a fan of this character, if you were a longtime fan of the comics, if you loved what they did in season 2 of Daredevil, you have to watch season 1 of Punisher, because pretty much everything that you were hoping that Frank Castle would bring to Netflix, he brings to Netflix. Hopefully we get a little bit more in season 2, but for what we got in season 1, I'm pretty damn happy. Recommend the hell out of this. Check it out on Netflix, and whenever it comes to Blu-ray, sometime in the next year or 2, go out and buy it. So what did you guys think of season 1 of The Punisher? Did you love this series? Did it feel a little bit too slow to you? Are you a fan of the comics like me and you think that they haven't quite pushed it to the full-on Punisher that they need to get to? Or are you pretty satisfied with this anti-hero, very heroic version of Frank Castle, and you don't want them to push him into the psychopathic murderer? Put all of your thoughts on The Punisher season 1, or any of your thoughts of just this Marvel Netflix universe altogether, down in the comment section below, and we'll talk about it. Please like and share this video. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber. If you want to check out some of my social media links, I've got Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter down in the video description below, as well as the link to my Patreon page, which is a great way to help this channel grow, give back to this channel, but also get exclusive content for your eyes only if you decide to become a patron. If you want to check out some more of my videos, as always, you can check them out by clicking right over here.